That bag of rice sitting in your pantry right now, the one you cook every single week without giving it a second thought, the one you boil for your kids specifically because it feels like the safest, simplest thing you could possibly serve them, plain rice. Nothing fancy, nothing processed, nothing with a long ingredient list to worry about. You assume that meant something. Grain, water, heat. That is the entire recipe. Rice has fed more people on this planet than any other single food for thousands of years across more cultures and more centuries than almost anything else humans eat. And it has never technically needed to be more complicated than that simple combination. Here is what almost nobody standing in the rice aisle actually knows before they toss a bag into their cart. Rice is one of the most efficient plants on Earth at absorbing arsenic directly out of soil and groundwater, as it grows a naturally occurring element that shows up in farmland and water tables across huge parts of the world, including major rice-growing regions right here in the United States. It is not something a company deliberately adds to the product. It is something the plant itself pulls up from the ground while it grows flooded in standing water for months at a time throughout the entire growing season, soaking in whatever happens to be present in that particular soil and that particular water the whole time. Some rice absorbs far more of it than others, depending entirely on where it was grown, what specific type of rice it is, and how it was processed after harvest. And most bags sitting on your grocery store shelf right now tell you absolutely nothing about any of that underlying picture. We pulled the packaging, the publicly available sourcing information, and the independent testing data on 8 of the biggest rice brands sold across America, the ones sitting in nearly every kitchen pantry in the country right now. We looked closely at where the rice actually comes from, what specific kind of rice it is, and what independent testing organizations and government agencies have actually found when they have gone in and checked directly. Some of what we found is completely normal for the category overall and genuinely not something to panic over. Some of it is worth knowing before you serve rice to your family 5 or 6 nights a week for the next 20 years without ever thinking twice about it. We are counting down from the least concerning entry to the most concerning. And at the end, I will give you 3 brands and sourcing strategies that are actually worth trusting with your family's dinner table. Let's get into it. Number 8. Mahatma Long Grain White Rice. Mahatma has been sitting on American grocery shelves for generations now, a name that feels almost generic at this point, simply because it has been the reflexive default white rice brand in so many households for so long that nobody really stops to think about it anymore. The packaging is simple, the price is low. Nobody standing in that aisle really questions it before tossing it in the cart alongside everything else on the weekly list. Long grain white rice, the specific type Mahatma primarily sells across most of its product line, is actually one of the lower concern categories when it comes to arsenic uptake compared to brown rice or rice grown in certain higher risk regions, because the milling process that turns brown rice into white rice physically removes the outer bran layer. And that outer bran layer is exactly where arsenic tends to concentrate most heavily inside the individual grain. That is a genuine, meaningful point in favor of a plain white long grain rice like this one. And it deserves to be said clearly. But Mahatma sources rice broadly from across the southern United States, including areas where independent testing conducted by consumer advocacy groups over the years has consistently found measurably higher average arsenic levels in rice compared to rice grown in California or imported from certain other regions with different soil profiles, largely because of decades of historical cotton farming in parts of the South that once used arsenic-based pesticides extensively, residue that can still linger quietly in agricultural soil today even though those specific pesticides were phased out and banned decades ago. Mahatma is not doing anything unusual or unique for the category here. It is simply a clear example of how regional sourcing quietly matters far more than most shoppers ever realize, and the bag itself sitting right there on the shelf gives you essentially zero information about which specific region your particular batch of rice actually came from. Number 7. Success. Rice, the boil and bag brand most people grew up microwaving or boiling on a rushed weeknight because it is fast, foolproof, and almost never turns out mushy or overcooked the way loose rice sometimes can. The entire brand promise built around this product is convenience above everything else. Rice ready in about 10 minutes with almost no realistic chance of messing it up even on your busiest night. The rice inside those individual bags is standard long grain white rice, sourced primarily from the same general growing regions as most mass-market American rice brands sold across the country. The convenient packaging itself, The individual sealed plastic pouches designed specifically for boiling does raise a separate and genuinely worthwhile question. Those bags get boiled directly in plastic, fully submerged in hot water for the entire cooking process from start to finish. And while the specific food-grade plastics used in boil and bag packaging are regulated and tested for safety at typical cooking temperatures, independent research into plastic leaching under sustained high heat exposure has generally found that repeated, prolonged exposure to near boiling temperatures can meaningfully increase the migration of trace plastic compounds into the food itself compared to cooking loose rice in a standard uncoated pot. It is a genuinely different consideration than arsenic content in the rice itself, but it is very much part of the full picture for a product built entirely around the idea of cooking food directly inside sealed plastic packaging every single time you use it. Number 6. Ben's Original, formerly marketed under a different name for many decades before the company publicly rebranded the entire product line back in 2021. Ben's Original built its core identity around parboiled rice, a specific processing method where the rice is partially boiled while it is still inside its husk before the milling process even begins, a technique that actually pushes more nutrients from the outer layers deeper into the grain itself before that outer layer eventually gets stripped away during milling. Parboiling is genuinely one of the better processing methods available when it comes to nutrient retention specifically, and that deserves real credit rather than being dismissed. However, published research into arsenic in the parboiling process has produced somewhat mixed and complicated findings over the years. Some studies suggest parboiling can actually increase the final concentration of arsenic that ends up in the milled grain compared to standard white rice processing, because the partial boiling step happens specifically while the arsenic-rich outer bran layer is still fully attached and in direct sustained contact with the rest of the grain, allowing more of that arsenic to migrate inward before the bran layer is eventually removed. Ben's Original does not publish batch-level arsenic testing results anywhere on their packaging or their official website, which means shoppers reaching for this specific brand precisely because parboiled sounds like the more nutritious, more thoughtfully processed option genuinely have no reliable way of knowing whether that processing choice is quietly working in their favor or working against them on this particular concern. Number 5. Great Value White Rice, Walmart's house brand, sold in truly enormous volume across nearly every single one of their stores nationwide, coast to coast. This is the rice that fills pantries specifically because it is cheap, always reliably in stock, and nearly identical in taste and texture to almost every name brand sitting right next to it on the exact same shelf, often at close to double the price for what amounts to a very similar product. Walmart does not publish specific regional sourcing information for its house brand rice beyond a fairly general country of origin statement printed on the bag, and the company does not publish independent arsenic testing results for consumers to review before making a purchase. Independent testing organizations that have surveyed store brand rice broadly across major national retailers have generally found levels roughly consistent with the wider category average overall, not notably worse than competitors, but also not notably better in any meaningful way. And critically, with essentially no brand-specific transparency that would actually let a shopper make an informed, educated choice between one bag and another sitting on that exact same shelf. At Walmart's massive operating scale, generating hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue every single year, publishing basic sourcing transparency and testing data is clearly not a genuine financial constraint holding them back. It is simply a decision the company has chosen not to make, which quietly leaves customers buying largely blind on a staple product they cook for their families multiple times nearly every single week of the year. Number 4. Uncle Ben's converted brand rice, now sold under its various current rebranded names, sourced heavily from the southern United States, an agricultural region that is mentioned earlier in this list, carries a well-documented history of arsenic-based pesticide use tied to cotton farming decades before rice ever became the dominant crop planted across much of that same farmland. Soil does not simply reset itself once a particular pesticide gets banned by regulators. Arsenic is a naturally occurring element, not an organic compound that gradually breaks down over time the way many banned pesticides eventually do in soil. And it can remain present and measurable in agricultural land for decades or even far longer after the original chemical application ever took place. Consumer Reports has conducted some of the most extensive independent arsenic testing on rice available anywhere to the general public testing. Dozens of different brands and rice types purchased directly off ordinary store shelves across the country. And that ongoing research has consistently found that rice grown broadly in the south-central United States, including several of the largest rice-producing states in that specific region, tends to show measurably higher average arsenic levels compared to rice grown in California, or rice imported from certain other countries with meaningfully different soil and water profiles. Brands sourcing heavily or almost exclusively from that particular region without offering shoppers any alternative sourcing option or any real transparency about where a specific bag on the shelf actually came from, are effectively asking customers to accept a well-documented regional risk factor while providing essentially zero information that would let anyone make an informed choice standing right there at the shelf. Number 3. Store-branded generic bagged white rice sold in bulk at discount grocery chains and wholesale membership clubs across the country. The large unbranded or only lightly branded sacks that dominate the bottom shelf specifically because of their extremely low price per pound compared to almost everything else in the aisle. This is really more of a broad category than any single named brand. Plain packaging carrying minimal printed information beyond a total weight and a price tag stapled to the bag. These particular products typically carry the least sourcing transparency of any category on this entire list by a fairly wide margin. Country of origin statements printed on these bags are often vague or deliberately blended across multiple growing regions within a single package, meaning the rice inside might actually come from several different farms spread across several different states, or even several different countries entirely, all mixed together during large-scale processing specifically to meet volume demand at the absolute lowest possible cost per pound. When rice originating from multiple regions with genuinely different soil and water profiles gets blended together into one single product, there is essentially no way for any individual consumer or, frankly, even the retailer selling it on their own shelf to know what the actual arsenic profile of that specific bag looks like because it was never sourced, tracked, or tested as one single traceable batch in the first place. Number 2. Certain imported jasmine and long grain rice blends sold under regional or discount grocery private labels frequently imported through multiple intermediary suppliers before ever reaching a US-based distributor, with country of origin labeling that can be technically accurate on paper while still being genuinely uninformative in practice, listing only a country of final processing or packaging rather than the actual country and specific growing region where the rice was originally cultivated and where it absorbed whatever happened to be present in that particular local soil and water supply. Rice grown in certain regions of Southeast Asia has in some independent testing efforts shown notably elevated arsenic levels tied to specific local agricultural practices and regional water sources, while rice grown in other regions within that exact same country has tested significantly cleaner by comparison, which means a single blanket country of origin label can end up obscuring an enormous amount of real underlying variation happening beneath it. Consumers reaching specifically for these particular products are frequently doing so precisely because they associate a certain country or culinary region with a specific tradition or reputation, choosing what feels intuitively like a more authentic, higher quality option compared to a plain generic domestic bag sitting nearby. Without batch-specific testing or genuinely clearer regional sourcing disclosure printed on the package, that underlying assumption of quality ends up being built entirely on branding, price point, and cultural association rather than on anything that has actually been independently verified through testing. If you have made it this far through the list, you're probably already thinking hard about the exact bag currently sitting in your own pantry right now. Subscribe to The Hidden Receipt right now because we do exactly this kind of deep dive every single week, pulling apart the sourcing and the testing data on everyday foods that most people simply assume are inherently simple and safe by default, so that you do not have to dig through government databases and dense industry reports yourself just to understand what you are actually cooking for your family. We have 2 more entries left to get through together. And the very next one is the specific type of rice that most health-conscious households in this country deliberately switched to over the last couple of decades, precisely because they genuinely believed it was the cleaner, more nutritious choice available. Number 1. Brown rice. Broadly across nearly every mass-market brand sold in this country, the category most people actively and deliberately switched to over the last 20 years or so, specifically because it felt like the more nutritious, more health-conscious option compared to plain white rice. More fiber content, more whole grain nutrition overall, and noticeably less processed in appearance and marketing language. That switch was made in genuine good faith by millions of households across the country actively trying to eat better and make smarter choices for their families. And in most respects that matter nutritionally, brown rice genuinely does offer more fiber and higher levels of certain nutrients compared to standard white rice. Here is the part that almost nobody factored into that well-intentioned decision at the time. The outer bran layer that gets physically removed during the milling process that turns brown rice into white rice is exactly where arsenic concentrates most heavily inside the individual grain, more than anywhere else, leaving that specific layer fully intact, which is the entire definitional difference separating brown rice from white rice at a chemical and structural level. Means brown rice consistently tests higher for arsenic across nearly every independent study, and every single brand surveyed by researchers regardless of price point, regardless of organic certification printed proudly on the front of the bag, and regardless of any marketing language used to sell it. This is not a brand-specific failure belonging to any one company. It is a structural fact rooted in how the grain itself gets physically processed, and it applies almost universally across the entire brown rice category as a whole. From the cheapest generic store brands sitting on the bottom shelf all the way up to the most expensive certified organic options sitting on the specialty food shelf at a premium grocery store. Families who deliberately switch to brown rice specifically to make the healthier choice for their kids, often eating it multiple times a week for years on end without a second thought, were making a genuinely reasonable, well-intentioned decision based entirely on the information that was actually available to them at the time, while an entire structural risk factor sat quietly unaddressed and largely unpublicized inside nearly every single bag in that category the whole time. That is the full list. 8 entries, one repeating pattern running quietly underneath nearly every single one of them from top to bottom. Regional sourcing that matters far more to the final product than most shoppers standing in that aisle ever realize. Processing methods actively marketed as more nutritious that can sometimes work directly against the exact concern shoppers are least aware of in the first place, and almost across the entire board. A near total absence of batch-level transparency that would actually let an ordinary person standing there in the aisle make a genuinely informed choice between 2 bags sitting right next to each other on the same shelf at the same price. Before we get to what is actually worth buying instead, here is something you could genuinely go do tonight with the exact bag already sitting in your own kitchen cabinet. No lab equipment or special certification required at all. Start with the sourcing test. Turn the bag around in your hands and look specifically for a name, state, or country of origin, not some vague blended statement covering multiple regions at once. Rice grown in California, for example, has consistently tested lower for arsenic across multiple independent surveys compared to rice grown broadly across the south-central United States, largely due to well-documented differences in regional soil history and irrigation water source that have essentially nothing to do with any single company's individual practices and everything to do with underlying geography itself. If the bag simply reads product of USA with no further meaningful detail beyond that, or lists several different countries blended together on the same label, that particular absence of specificity is itself genuinely useful information worth noting, because a brand that is confident in clean, fully traceable sourcing generally has every practical incentive to put that specific information front and center on the packaging rather than deliberately leave it out entirely. Then run the rinse test, which will not meaningfully change the arsenic content already absorbed into the grain during its months in the field, but is genuinely worth doing anyway as a simple habit. Rinsing your rice thoroughly before cooking, and then cooking it in a noticeably larger volume of water that you subsequently drain off afterward, rather than relying on the traditional absorption method where every single drop of water gets fully absorbed directly into the grain, has been shown across published research to reduce the final arsenic content of cooked rice by a genuinely meaningful percentage. In some published studies by close to half compared to the standard absorption cooking method most households default to without ever thinking twice about it. It is a small, simple change in everyday technique that costs absolutely nothing extra and adds essentially no meaningful time to your normal cooking routine. Finally, run the variety test. Basmati rice particularly. Basmati imported from certain specific growing regions along with sushi rice grown domestically in California have both consistently tested lower for arsenic across multiple independent surveys compared to most other long-grain white rice varieties on the market, and dramatically lower compared to brown rice across the board without exception. If arsenic exposure is a genuine ongoing concern for your household, particularly for young children who often eat rice cereal or various rice-based snacks quite frequently relative to their much smaller body weight, the specific variety and geographic origin you choose at the store matters considerably more in the end than either the price point or the organic label printed prominently on the front of the bag. Now, 3 options that are actually genuinely worth trusting, based directly on sourcing transparency and independently documented testing patterns gathered over time. The first good pick is California-grown long grain or sushi rice specifically, particularly brands that clearly state California as the actual growing region right there on the packaging itself, rather than burying it in fine print. Independent testing conducted repeatedly by Consumer Reports and several other consumer advocacy organizations has consistently found California-grown rice to test measurably lower for arsenic on average compared to rice grown broadly across the south-central United States, largely tied directly to well-documented differences in regional soil composition and irrigation water source that have nothing to do with any individual company's practices and everything to do with basic underlying geography. Brands like Lundberg Family Farms, which grows the large majority of its total rice supply in California and openly publishes clear information about its specific growing regions and farming practices, represent a genuinely strong example of this entire category done right, combining a natural regional advantage with actual meaningful sourcing transparency that most competitors on the shelf simply do not bother offering at all. The second good pick is authentic basmati rice imported specifically from regions with documented lower average arsenic testing results over time. Sold specifically under brands that clearly and openly disclose their country and region of origin right there on the packaging rather than relying on a vague blended statement designed to obscure the details. Basmati as a distinct variety has generally tested lower across multiple independent surveys compared to most other common rice types sold in stores. And pairing that inherent variety advantage together with a brand that is genuinely transparent about its specific sourcing gives you meaningfully more useful information at the shelf than a generic long-grain bag offering no regional disclosure whatsoever. The third good pick is simply adjusting your own cooking method at home. Regardless of which specific brand or bag you already happen to have sitting in your pantry right now this very moment, rinse your rice thoroughly before cooking every single time. Cook it in a noticeably larger volume of water using the drain method rather than defaulting to the traditional absorption method. And rotate your rice varieties throughout the week rather than relying on brown rice or a single South Central sourced long grain as your only staple meal after meal, week after week after month after month. This particular change costs nothing extra at all, requires absolutely no brand switch or additional grocery spending, and is genuinely one of the most effective, well-documented, low-cost ways available to meaningfully reduce overall exposure without spending a single extra dollar at the store next time you shop. Here is the one rule genuinely worth keeping the very next time you find yourself standing in the rice aisle deciding what actually goes into your cart for the week. Turn the bag around in your hands and look specifically for a named region, not just a vague general country label printed somewhere on the front. Ask yourself honestly whether this particular brand is actually willing to tell you exactly where your food came from, in specific and traceable terms. A company that is genuinely confident in what it is selling generally has every practical reason to tell you clearly and proudly. A company that consistently leaves that specific information out has quietly made a choice too, even if it never once says so directly anywhere on the printed package itself. If this changed the way you think about something as simple, everyday, and universal as a plain bag of rice, hit the like button right now before you move on to something else. And tell me down in the comments which specific brand was sitting in your own pantry before you started watching this. Subscribe to the Hidden Receipts so that you catch it every single time we open up another everyday household staple that nobody else out there is actually bothering to read closely enough. Stay sharp. Read the back of the bag before you ever trust the front of it, and I will see you in the next one.